This video is going to explain how to write your literature review. So the literature review assignment you can think of as like a rough draft. You're going to hand in your literature review to other people on your literature review, and they're going to give feedback to you. And then based on that feedback, you're going to do the assignment again, and that's going to be your midterm exam or exam one. So, when you're writing a literature review, I think it's helpful if you put everything into like a picture, like a figure, because as you probably noticed as you were gathering sources for your annotated bibliography, you're reading a lot of stuff that may or may not be helpful for you to write your literature review. Again, the literature review is an argumentative essay where you're going to use citations from peer-reviewed literature to support your assertions, but ultimately you're going to make an argument about the relationship between two variables, and you're going to move from like concept down to the actual variable itself. So we're going to focus on what causes the outcome. The outcome is often referred to as the dependent variable, and the treatment. The treatment is often referred to as the independent variable. So we're going to draw a little diagram so we can try to explain what we think is causing the outcome variable or the thing we're trying to explain, and what we think is the independent variable that leads to that. So in this particular assignment, you were asked to develop an idea about how belief in conspiracy theories is related to support for democracy. And in that literature review, you probably found a number of things that influence support for democracy. Political tolerance was one of them. Interpersonal trust is another one of them, right? So you could make this argument that it shows on this diagram right here, where you're saying that support for democracy, that conspiracy theories or belief in conspiracy theories has a direct effect on support for democracy. But we also know that tolerance and trust influence democracy, so we're going to control those two variables. This is a completely reasonable argument that you make, and then based on this, you would say, okay, here's the literature that I need to talk about this and this relationship, and then I'm going to develop this relationship all on its own. You might also say that conspiracy theories has an indirect effect, that there might be some direct influence, but maybe it's not like really strong, powerful, but really people who believe in conspiracy theories maybe don't trust other people as much, or maybe don't trust um, broader individuals in society. Or maybe people who believe in conspiracy theories are less tolerant of their political enemies. And in that way, maybe conspiracy theories has an indirect influence on support for democracy because it maybe influences this or maybe it influences that. You could make that argument too. And there's ways that you could statistically test these hypotheses if that's what you want to do. At the same time, you probably also notice that civic engagement has its own independent effect on support for democracy. People who are involved in their community are more supportive of democracy. People who are more educated, that's what cognitive mobilization, people who are more educated, more informed about politics, are also more supportive of democracy and do things that make democracy work. So, right, this here is also a very reasonable argument. The challenge that happens is that as you've been reading literature, you've been seeing all these other arrows moving in different directions. Like this influences trust, this influences tolerance, support for democracy influences tolerance, and vice versa. There's all of these moving pieces. If you have a literature review that reads like this, where you're just telling me everything that you found and how it's together, it's going to be a very bad literature review. You have a really difficult time making sense of that. Strongly encourage you to first think about what argument you want to make, what you're going to have to control for. You can't just write this because there's other things that influence support for democracy that you need to include as control variables. And then you need to have a really good explanation for how conspiracy theories influences that while controlling for all of these other things that are known to influence support for democracy. So what you're doing in a literature review, things that are redundant, things that are irrelevant, right? Trying to avoid, you're not just telling me everything that you found. You're finding the things that are most important for the argument you want to make. This is the reason. So there's a person named Tyler V, Tyler F. Eigen, or whatever his name is. He finds all of these correlations between things, right? So here's an example. Coca-Cola stock price, right? There's a really high correlation between people searching on Google, who is J.K. Rowling, and the stock price of Coca-Cola. Now, let's say that you were made the CEO of Coca-Cola. The CEO's primary job is to make sure that the stock price goes up. And let's say that you're like, hey, I've got this really great idea. I've found statistically this really strong relationship between Google searches for who is J.K. Rowling and the Coca-Cola stock prices. So, what we're going to do for the next year as CEO of Coca-Cola, we're going to put a lot of resources into talking about J.K. Rowling so the people who've never heard of J.K. Rowling are going to do a Google search for her, and that's going to boost our stock price. You see how ludicrous that sounds? You see how like silly that would be to do that? So the idea of a literature review is so that in the end, when you test a hypothesis and you find some kind of a correlation, people believe you. You don't say, "Oh, that's the most stupid thing I've ever heard in my life. Why would we do that?" Well, it's because you've got a literature review that explains why you would focus on that. So you want to have, and ultimately you want to have a testable hypothesis, right? You want to have this statement at the end that says, based on what we've read in the literature about conspiracy theories and support for democracy, here's what I think is going to happen. And then you have this really nice sentence like, people who believe in conspiracy theories are going to be more supportive of democracy, or they're going to be more politically tolerant, or they're going to be more trusting of other people, or less, or whatever it is you want to argue. But the whole point of the literature review is to set it up so that in the end, if you find a statistically significant relationship, then it logically makes sense based on everything we know about that topic from the past. So, how do you write your literature review? So, you're not just summarizing things. You're not just, you're talking about what has been done in the past, what they found, what variables need to be controlled for. Maybe there's two variables that are really measuring the same thing, and you say, you know what, these could just be combined. You're looking at how they tested things and the strengths and the weaknesses of that previous literature. And this is all written in an essay format where you just pepper in citations. So this is an example, right, based on exam one that you've, or the assignment that you have coming up. Why do people believe in conspiracy theories? What kind of attitudes are essential for democracy? And then you're going to make that into a contribution all your own. So first paragraph, or the first part, is you're going to compose an essay of about like 5 to 6 paragraphs about why people believe in conspiracy theories. The first paragraph is just going to be this big broad overview of all the highly cited stuff of why people believe in conspiracy theories. And then you're going to narrow that down into an argument that you want to make, right? If I was going to make an argument about uh, that participation in social groups is an important part of democracy, and I think that conspiracy theory somehow influences whether or not a person's going to participate in civic organizations, then I would focus on the aspects of conspiracy theories. Like, again, I don't remember this literature real well, so I don't know if this is a great argument that is actually supported by the literature, but I would probably focus on things that are like people who have distrust of the man or higher organizations or of institutions. They tend to believe in conspiracy theories, but as people gain actual experience with an organization, they tend to be less likely to believe conspiracy theories about that organization. So, to some extent, belief in conspiracy theories is also just a sign that a person is not involved in civic organizations. And that the more they're involved in civic organizations, the less likely they are going to be to believe in conspiracy theories in the first place. So I would focus on that, right? How conspiracy theory beliefs sort of come from this idea that you're not really involved, you're not really participating, you're sort of on the periphery, on the outside looking in. And I would focus maybe on articles that make that kind of an argument. And then I would say, and then after that, I'd say, but with all of this great work that's been done on conspiracy theories, like there's some good, there's some bad. What we really don't know is if there's a direct influence on belief in conspiracy theories and support for democracy. And then you're going to do the next thing on support for democracy, right? 5 to 6 paragraphs about what makes democracy work. So you got this big overview of like maybe you talk about the civic culture, or maybe you talk about Putnam and Bowling Alone and stuff like that. And you say like there are all these big things about like you can't just take the U.S. Constitution and dump it in any country in the world and have it work. The people have to have certain attitudes. And what are those attitudes that people need to have in order for democracy to work as a system of government? And so then you focus in this particular case, I'm going to focus more on civic engagement. So I would talk more about the bowling stuff, and I would talk about how people who are participating in societies, like in civic organizations, are more likely to participate in or to do things that are conducive to democracy. I'd focus on all that. I'd say, but there's a lot more going on than what we know from this current literature, right? With all the strengths and weaknesses, I would make sure to mention something like, and nobody's ever thought about like, how do conspiracy theories relate to this idea? And then now I'm going to put it all together, right? Remember all that stuff I said about why people believe conspiracy theories? And remember what I said about participation in civic organizations? It makes sense to me that people who participate in civic organizations are going to be likely to believe in conspiracy theories. Therefore, state my hypothesis, people who believe conspiracy theories will be less likely to participate in civic organizations, something like that, right? And then that's a testable hypothesis that I can measure in some way. Paragraphs 3 through 5, like that's usually a good thing to do, right? And talk about why your method is going to be an improvement on other stuff. But you can also finish with your hypothesis. You don't need to write a conclusion. You're not anywhere close to being able to do that, right? You're just doing the literature review, developing the hypothesis based on existing research and the arguments and logical reasoning that you're using, and then you're ending with a testable hypothesis.